Adesso è con un po' di trepidazione che presento il nostro keynote speaker, il professor Matteo Maggiori. Matteo è Associate Professor of Finance alla Stanford Business School, è laureato in economia all'Università Luis Guido Carli a Roma. Dopo ha fatto un percorso, diciamo, molto Bay Area, ha fatto un PhD a Berkeley, ha girovagato un po' per gli Stati Uniti e poi è finito di nuovo qua a Stanford. Non lo metterò in imbarazzo chiedendogli per quale squadra tifa, se è per quella del PhD o per quella che gli paga lo stipendio. Magari poi te lo chiedo in camera caritatis e ti confesserò per chi tifo io, visto che siamo in una situazione simile da questo punto di vista. Per quanto sia giovane, Matteo ha già vinto una gran quantità di premi molto prestigiosi, iniziando con la medaglia Carlo Alberto per il miglior economista italiano sotto i 40 anni, una Guggenheim Fellowship, un NSF Career Award, nel 2021, per il 2021, il premio Fisher Black per il miglior economista al mondo nel campo della finanza sotto i 40 anni, un premio estremamente prestigioso. Professor Maggiori will speak in English as we plan to post his talk for broader consumption on our website. He will talk about the economics of debt in a post-COVID world. At the end of the talk, you'll be able to ask questions. Please post them in the chat box and I will read them out loud. Matteo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for the very kind introduction, indeed too kind. And I wanted to thank ISSNAF for inviting me to give this short lecture, particularly since I'm very new to the Bay Area in some sense. As a faculty member, I just came back to the Bay Area last year in December. Of course, as Alberto pointed out, I had been in the Bay Area before. I did my PhD here in Berkeley, so it was very good to be back into the Bay Area, and I will take Alberto the Fifth Amendment on Stanford versus Berkeley very much, as I'm sure you would. I would also like to thank Ambassador Varricchio for being here with us tonight. It's always a wonderful recognition of seeing the embassy paying attention to the development of science in the United States, and in particular the development that comes from those of us that live here but are Italian. Similarly, I would really like to thank very warmly the Italian consul in San Francisco, Lorenzo Ortona. It wasn't a week that I'd been in San Francisco when he reached out. We had coffee. It really made me feel part of the community, and immediately extended both his welcome, but also his network here in the Bay Area to me. So I would really like to thank him. For tonight, I will talk about a topic that it's quite crucial for both the United States and Italy. So I thought it would be a very good topic to discuss with you tonight, which is debt, the rising pile of debt that both these economies are accumulating. In particular, these days, that's all over the news because the American government, with the new administration, is going to go through a massive expansion of fiscal stimulus to fight the pandemic, and that will increase in future years the debt to GDP ratio. As you know, Italy has had problems with the debt to GDP ratio for, at least since I started paying attention to economics. We've had a crisis not long ago. In March, we had a bit of a wobble. So these are things that really interest us both in terms of our daily economic life, and of course, at a more scientific level, because we would like to understand what's happening. So let me start with a simple disclaimer. Spending money during a pandemic, it's a very good idea if you have fiscal capacity. If you're in a position as a government to help people transition to this incredible hardship, it's obviously a good idea. And yet we have to worry about not using too much of that ability, precisely because there will be future crises. In the last 15 years, we've seen the global financial crisis, the European sovereign debt crisis, and the pandemic. So these things do happen, and we want governments to be in a position to spend money when they need to. So the problem is, how do you do that? And here's where my research comes in a little bit. So I've been thinking for a while, particularly from the perspective of the United States, a country that is at the core of the monetary system. What are the risks of blowing up? Now, this might seem a little bit odd to you because we think of the country at the core of the monetary system as the ultimate safe country. You buy US treasuries because they're the safest thing you can get out there. And yet, if you look over a long span of history, very often you find crises that are very deep, where the country at the core of the system tends to collapse financially. You might remember, England was at the core of the financial system until a crisis in the beginning of the 30s, where it had to depreciate the pound compared to gold. The United States then made a commitment to keep the dollar stable with respect to gold. And yet in 1973, there was so much pressure on the dollar, in particular with European countries asking in some sense their money back, threatening to convert the dollars back into gold, that the US had to go off gold. Despite the fact that these things happen rarely, when you expand the horizon long enough, they do happen, and they tend to be quite severe in terms of crisis. And that's why we like studying them. Now, the way I would encourage you to think about this, imagine that there are two worlds out there. There's one world where everybody thinks the United States is going to be safe. And what do we mean by that? We mean that in the next crisis, very much like in the current one, the United States will choose a combination of monetary and fiscal policy that makes the debt of the United States very safe for foreigners. So the dollar doesn't depreciate massively, we don't inflate. So the real value, if you're, for example, a European holding treasuries, of having those bonds is quite high. Under that world, everybody's willing to buy American debt, even at extremely low interest rates, because it is such a good hedge against this global crisis. Given very low interest rates, the debt is actually very easy to repay. In fact, one of the most paradoxical phenomena that we've seen over the last 10 years is that as the US skyrocketed its debt over GDP, it's now at the highest level it has ever been in peacetime, at least since World War II. Interest rates have actually come down, so that despite the fact that the US has a lot of federal debt, the cost of servicing the debt has actually gone down. It doesn't take that much of a primary surplus, as in what you are left as a government after you paid for your fiscal policy and running the government with taxes to repay the debt. That has shrunk quite substantially. Now, imagine that there is another world. There is a world out there where global investors, maybe it might be the Chinese, it might be the Europeans, start worrying that the debt pile for the US, it's so high that in the next crisis, the government might find it unappealing to pursue policies that maintain the value of the debt very high. So what could the government do in the next crisis? It could decide to inflate. It could decide to simply default outright, although that happens very rarely for governments such as the United States. Or it might impose legislation that essentially arms twist some people into holding the debt. That's what economists call financial repression. You might, for example, call some governments or some banks over which you have political power and try to force them to hold the debt at artificially low interest rates. Those are all things that have in common reducing the real value of what the government is repaying. Now, suppose that you think that that's a real possibility. And all of a sudden, you might not be willing to buy the debt at low interest rates. Indeed, you will require very high interest rates because you want to be compensated for the fact that it's no longer a hedge for the future crisis. Under those high interest rates, because the government has such a high pile of debt, it becomes difficult to repay. And indeed, the government doesn't want to. So you can see there is a self-fulfilling element to this. And this has been around in economics forever. It's how we model this type of crisis. Now, where the interesting element comes in is, will the government choose to risk it? Suppose that you are the new US Secretary of Treasury and you would like to decide, should I risk it? Should I expand the debt and hoping for a good equilibrium, or should I be more careful? Now, in my research, together with a colleague at Harvard, we went through a very simple model to think about under which conditions do we have to worry that the country at the core of the system might have incentives to blow it up. And actually, the conditions are quite natural if you think about them. One is when there's a lot of demand for treasuries. When the world really wants safe assets, if things go well and there is no crisis, you look like a genius. You just simply expanded your balance sheet tremendously. You issued a lot of debt at very low interest rates. You can fight the pandemic. You can pursue social programs. It looks like if you didn't, you would be wasting an opportunity. So you're very tempted to do it, even if you understand that this might be deleterious if interest rates change. The other place where you need to worry is when we're at what economists call the zero lower bound, where we are right now in the US, when interest rates are zero and the true shadow rate is much below zero. Why do you have to worry about those states of the world? Because there is no discipline from issuing more debt. interest rates don't come up with the debt. In fact, it looks for a while that it's a very good policy. You can issue a ton of debt without pushing the interest rates up. And the problem comes if in the future, those interest rates can change quite abruptly. Now, nothing of what I'm saying is about the next few years. You need to take a much longer horizon. Where is the political economy problem? The problem is that there isn't a single politician out there that wants to run on a platform saying, we should spend now, but in the future, I will try to bring the debt down so that I can spend when the next crisis comes. It's just not a very palatable proposition. Everybody has their own agenda of what to do with with revenue from the government, and nobody wants to maintain fiscal capacity, the ability to do this in the future. And that's a little bit of the problem. Economists are starting to awaken to the idea that there is no problem now, we should fight the pandemic, but there is a problem in not wanting to think about far into the future, how we're gonna keep servicing this debt, and how we're gonna bring it back down. Now that brings me to Italy, which I will review quickly, because Italy is a very good test case. We've gone through that. We have piled up an immense amount of debt, and we have gotten into a crisis in 2011 and 12, where the rest of the world didn't think that we were going to repay. Interest rates went up, what you've seen in the newspapers in Italy as the spread, as in interest rates in Italy over interest rates in Germany. At those high interest rates, it was very difficult for the government to repay the debt, because now it's very expensive to service the same amount of debt. And if it wasn't for the ECB, we would have gone into the bad options. Default, well, we can't inflate because we're on the euro. Some form of financial repression forcing Italian banks to hold the debt. Those are the options you're left with. There isn't much else other than a massive crash in fiscal spending where you need to cut primary spending a lot. So we have gone through that. Now, during the pandemic, Italy hasn't had this problem. And one of the things that I would like to highlight, because perhaps it's not so obvious, not to the people in this virtual room, but to the general Italian public, is how much of solidarity we've actually have gotten out of the European institutions. If the ECB hadn't stepped in pretty much explicitly, saying that if the spreads were going to widen, they were going to fight it, we would have had to go through a pandemic as a government, not only worrying about the pandemic, but worrying about a sovereign debt crisis. Having the ability not to do that, it's extremely valuable, and it's very hard to communicate it to the general public. But when there is talk about solidarity from the rest of Europe, that is one incredible insurance policy. For a government such as ours to be able to fight the pandemic without having to worry about the debt, it's an incredible advantage. And if you want to have a quick sense of what would have happened, in March, there was a bit of a wobble at the ECB where the current president didn't make it quite as clear as perhaps she intended to, that she was going to support credit spreads. And the market immediately went crazy. Spreads widened almost immediately. And it's only after a few hours when the ECB clarified that indeed they would support through the pandemic governments with weaker finances, that the spreads came down. Where does that leave us in Italy? Well, it leaves us with bad options, unfortunately. It leaves us with reforms that still need to take place. It leaves us again with political parties that aren't necessarily running on a platform of bringing down that debt pile is going to be important because we want to have fiscal space when the inevitable next crisis comes over. So unfortunately, there isn't an obvious plan to get rid of this problem. And we have to think that as we emerge from the pandemic, it's not going to be obvious how the solidarity within Europe or the architecture of Europe will play out. It should be quite clear to everybody that unilateral commitments to maintain the debt of weak governments forever without any reforms are essentially a fiscal transfer. And it is very unlikely that those fiscal transfers are going to be sustainable with the electorate of nations such as Germany that do perceive them as a pure transfer. So we have a limited ability to maneuver, but it's just very, very important not to waste it. Because going through a crisis where you have to cut the budget massively, like Greece had to do during 2011 and 12, it's socially incredibly expensive. It does fall very heavily on the weaker parts of the population, the poor, the unemployed. And so that one, I think it's really something to pay attention to, and something that collectively as social scientists, we can try to inform the general public on, because ultimately that's what's going to push Parliament or those in charge of fiscal policy to go through those reforms. So I will stop here. This was a high-level introduction, but I'm very, very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Matteo. This was really great. While the fingers of people asking questions warm up on the chat, I had a first one. Is there a sense for, we always talk about the post-pandemic world, but is there a sense among economists of how long it will take to go back to whatever people would call the normal, or at least recover some of the economy that's been lost?
So there's a lot of debate, and the reality is we don't really know. But I think what we might be good at is telling you a little bit of the logic that people are going through. So one hope is that a pandemic, contrary to a normal recession, it's a little bit like hitting a pause button. That we're all at home, but we're all ready to go back to work. We're all ready to jump on the next flight as soon as we have the vaccine and go to restaurants. And in fact, there might be even some eagerness to do that. And so you might get a very rapid recovery. However, there are other things that we might not be seeing. For example, a lot of people got terminated in terms of their employment. Some firms are shutting down. Some firms are no longer servicing some areas or having some inputs from some other parts of the world. And what we do know from past recessions is that once those links are broken, it's extremely difficult to put them in place again. It takes some time. And so these two forces are fighting each other, and we don't know when the economy reopens what it's going to look like, what is going to prevail. In particular, a lot of the current fiscal spending is precisely to support both people that are unemployed, but also firms, so they don't have to fire workers and break those relationships that we're worried about putting into place again. That's the target. Now, whether that's happening or not is very, very difficult to see in real time. And so that there's a bit of worry on both sides, and that probably, the longer this goes on, the more one has to worry that the negative side will prevail, which is part of the reason why we're all keen as economists on vaccination.
Thank you, Matteo. I don't see questions in the chat, but if someone has a question, you can raise your hand in the reaction box if you have the newest version of Zoom, and we'll unmute you. And we'll wait a couple of minutes.
Oh, I see some questions popping up. So I'll read them just for the record for the video. So Massimiliano Frattoni is asking, do you think there is a country, do you think that as a country there will be a benefit from the pandemic? Very difficult to say. There's also a big difference between short-run benefits and long-run benefits. In the short run, I doubt it. In the long run, one of the things that are certainly in everybody's mind is China. I mean, China is growing fast again. It is forecasted that their share of world GDP that is accounted for by China, it's going to grow even faster as other economies are taking much longer. And so that's one possibility. It's certainly everybody's guess, depending on how the other economies recover. But certainly, for better or for worse, the Chinese political system seems to have been able to deal with the pandemic very differently from Western democracies. So they've already reopened and they're running at roughly full speed. That one is a very interesting dynamic. I'm no expert, and perhaps the ambassador will have much better information, but it seems that it will be very difficult to enforce the type of lockdowns that they have enforced in a Western democracy. So I'm not sure that there is even a possibility. And then Maurizio Gianola is asking, as you stated this,
it's probably easier if I read it for you.
Oh, perfect, thank you.
As you stated, the ECB supported Italy recently. Who is going to be there to support the USA should the US lose the confidence of the world?
Oh, that's actually a very interesting question. So the country at the core of the system is very special precisely because there's nobody left to support it. It is the ultimate country that is in charge of the system. So it's very similar to England in the 1920s. And that's why when the crisis happened to those countries, they tend to be devastating because there is no easy fix. For a country such as Greece, you could have Germany or the rest of Europe or the IMF supporting it. There is no sense in which you're going to be able to support the entire system. And that's why we worry about this crisis. And again, they're very infrequent, but when they happen, they truly are brutal. And that's what we care about as economists.
From Claudio Pellegrini, can Italy ever repay a growing debt without increasing the productivity? And can we increase the productivity without a massive increase in research and development, which is very low in Italy?
That's a very good question. So the answer is no. It seems very, very difficult to repay the debt. In particular, I mean, it should be relatively obvious that we're in a worse position now than we were during the crisis of 2012. I mean, we will emerge from the pandemic as a country with a higher debt to GDP ratio and growth that is roughly unchanged. And that one tells us that we're going to have problems as soon as the ECB withdraws their support, or if you were to withdraw the support. The productivity question is an excellent one. As an economist, I always feel it's a bit cheap to say one option is to increase productivity because it's the family budget equivalent of do more with less. It's wonderful, but it's not so straightforward to do it, particularly in the short run. Now, there are reforms that eventually will filter through productivity, but there is no magic wand of increasing productivity next year. So you're clearly stepping up research and development, making the labor market more flexible. Those are all very, very sensible things. But you have to do them way ahead of when you are against the ropes. The typical experience that Italy has had for the last 20, 30 years is that we try to do these reforms only when we are against the ropes. And as soon as we move away from those, there is just no political willingness. And so it's, I think our role collectively as social scientists and scientists to sort of try to make the case for those reforms. They have to be made in normal times. They're very, very difficult to do once you're already deep into a recession. But in normal times, there's no political willingness.
Thank you. From Alberto Acito, recent statistics are showing US families accumulating savings, mostly due to reduced spending. Is there a solid study forecasting an uptake of consumer spending and therefore how this will impact prices and therefore interest rates?
That's an excellent question. So it's absolutely true. With the pandemic, what you see is private savings going up a lot. That's roughly for people like us, I presume, that are all quite fortunate in life. We have high salaries, a relatively high job security. We have nothing that we would like to spend the money on. I simply do not want to go to a restaurant because of the virus. And so the money sits in my bank account. The government spending has gone up a lot. So that's gone the opposite direction. And so that accounts, for example, for a widening trade deficit for the US. What has really happened is that people like us, that we spend a lot of time on, well, I shouldn't publicize Amazon, but on some online shopping platform trying to buy durable goods from the rest of the world. And those tend to be imported in the US. So that feeds into the idea that once the economy restarts, we might have an unusually fast recovery because there has been these savings. But let me also emphasize that's extremely different across different segments of the population. I mean, there are a lot of people that are seriously suffering, that got laid off, have low savings. Those are not perhaps the people on this call. They're certainly not university professors with tenure, but they do exist. It's a large chunk of the population. So the aggregate statistics are masking a lot of heterogeneity on the private savings side.
We actually have a lot of questions, but we'll need to move on. So I'll pick two. They're randomly picked. You'll have to trust me. But what this tells me is that we should invite you to give a back talk, and so you'll get peppered with a lot more questions. So here's one before last from Roberta Sala. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. You concluded by referring to basically educating the general public on the matter, but how can we effectively do it? As scientists, we struggle with this every day, and we do see this even during the pandemic, despite evidences. Do you have any suggestion on this difficult topic? Thank you again.
I don't, and I failed miserably at it myself, in the sense that, like many of us on this call, there is always a trade-off between, doing my own research, which is what I love doing, which takes an incredible amount of time and effort, and I want to be alone and in peace and thinking, and sort of doing events or speaking to journalists or sort of trying to be part of the public discourse, because ultimately we care about our social impact. And the pandemic, for all of you that are scientists, has been an incredible sort of challenge to do that. I think there is no substitute for trying. I mean, what I've become convinced is that you need to take your chances, and sometimes people will misinterpret you, sometimes they will misquote you, sometimes they will just ignore you, but we just have to try. Where you draw the line, I think it's a personal preference. You know, I wish there was somebody else doing it so that I don't have to do it. And there are people that do it very well. I try to do it a bit. How much? I'm still struggling with that. Just the way it is.
Okay, last question. I just want to remind everyone, Matteo had a very hard stop at 6:30, so he already was very generous with his time. So very last question. Can you comment on modern monetary theory, which seems to be becoming fashionable in some places, and their claim that setting the printing presses loose doesn't come with as much danger as mainstream economics say? Related to this, how do you know when debt is too much?
Okay. So let me answer the first part. You know, Voltaire said of the Holy Roman Empire that it wasn't Roman, it wasn't an empire, and it certainly wasn't holy. And I think about the same thing about modern monetary theory. It's not a theory, it's not modern, it's barely monetary. What it is just a marketing device for, you know, you can print money and you don't have to repay it. And to any sort of mainstream economist, we know where that ends. That ends like every other sort of such statement with a crisis. Now, across countries, it depends whether it's the extreme left or the extreme right that view it favorably. They generally tend to be people that just want to spend the money and they want to find an argument for that. So I think it's extremely dangerous. Now, there are very good reasons in economics why you might think that spending money pays for itself. There are very mainstream, well thought about theories that you might like or not like, but that's not one of those. And unfortunately, it has a bit of an element to put it in context of a group of scientists with all you hear about vaccines and all the rest, where you're just shaking your head and going like, no, there are many things that we don't know, but these we do know to be crazy. Economists feel about MMT pretty much the same way. There are many things that I don't know and that all of the profession doesn't, but that those things end up in a crisis, I'm pretty confident. It's relatively basic. When do you know that debt is too much? That's very difficult. So here's why. You want to think of the crisis I just described almost as a bank run. People one day realize that the bank isn't doing well. Everybody shows up and tries to withdraw the money, and that's when the crisis happens. We have almost no idea when it happens. I mean, Italy has had a high debt to GDP ratio for a long time. Why was it 2012 that people picked for the crisis? Very difficult to pin down. So, you know, there's a misconception that economists are good at forecasting. We're actually pretty terrible at forecasting. I hate doing it because I have no particular skill over any of you, or even, frankly, over the misinformed general public about forecasting the future. What I might be better, or what collectively as economists we're better at, is figuring out the mechanism, what might happen should a shock occur. You really want to think of high debt level, just make you exposed to that possibility. One is too high. The quickest way to do it is to think about, suppose that you have, you know, level of debt X and the interest rates went to 6%. Would you sustain the debt? If at some point you start understanding that that's not feasible, you're already too far. So at 40% debt to GDP ratios, I didn't worry. At 100% debt to GDP ratios in the US, we have to start having the conversation. At 200, we're in the worried zone. Somewhere in the between, it's too much. It's a very rough answer, but honestly, I don't think we have a much better answer than what I'm giving you as a first approximation.
Well, thank you, Matteo, for a truly fantastic and stimulating presentation. We'll have you again now that we know where you live.
Of course.
Thank you again.
I'll be here.